Good morning, 6th grade. Sorry about the problem with the video. Hopefully this one will load faster. I don't know what the deal was, but that one literally took 2 tries to get to load and then still took most of the day. So that was a mess yesterday. Hopefully this goes better. So we had talked about kind of the Revolutionary War, things leading up to the Revolutionary War, leading up to the Articles of Confederation. Read a little bit about the Articles of Confederation, what a mess that was. Now we are on the Constitutional Convention. By the 1780s, it was clear to many Americans that the Articles of Confederation were not working. The 13 original states were looking after their own affairs, leaving the fledgling or the young new nation with a weak federal government. The states were not united as one nation. Something had to be done, and it began with a quarrel between Maryland and Virginia. So that's something that you'll want to put in your notes, is that something that lets me know that you know that there was a dispute between Maryland and Virginia, and that when the government realized they couldn't handle it under this form of government, that's when they realized they need to do something different. So here's what the dispute was. The Potomac River flows between the states of Maryland and Virginia. However, instead of being divided down the middle, which is how river borders are usually agreed, Maryland had been granted the whole of the river. This upset Virginia, which wanted an equal share. The federal government had no powers to intervene, because remember, that was one of the problems with the Articles of Confederation. They couldn't settle disputes between states. An idea takes shape. Before the Maryland-Virginia quarrel got out of hand, James Madison suggested that officials from both states got together to work out a solution. This discussion between the two states took place at George Washington's Mount Vernon estate in March 1785. As a next step, they decided to include Pennsylvania in future talks. Seeing how the states were cooperating with each other gave Madison a new idea. He wondered if all 13 states could agree on forming a federal government. In September 1786, 5 states met in Annapolis, Maryland. They proposed that all states should send delegates to a meeting in Philadelphia the following year. Charles Thomson, Secretary of Congress, said a government without a visible head must appear a strange phenomenon to European officials. James Madison, a man with a plan. James Madison gave a lot of thought to the idea of a federal government. A few weeks before the meeting in Philadelphia, he wrote to the officials of the 13 states introducing his ideas. By the time the delegates of the states met at the Constitutional Convention in May 1787, Madison's plan for a federal constitution were well known. So, who's the guy that came up with the plan for the Constitutional Convention and wrote letters to all the states? That's something you need to answer in your notes you're taking. The state of Virginia sent 2 delegates to the meeting, James Madison and George Washington. The Constitution is discussed. The convention was held at the Philadelphia State House. And here's a picture of the Philadelphia State House. The convention was held at the Philadelphia State House. It began on May 25th, and George Washington was appointed as the presiding officer. From the start, James Madison spoke convincingly about the need to replace the Articles of Confederation with a Constitution, a set of rules that laid down the basis of the country's first national government. Through the summer of 1787, a total of 55 delegates from 12 of the 13 states attended the Constitutional Convention. Only Rhode Island didn't attend, as it felt a strong federal government would end up taking away power from the states and leaving them weaker. Sign here. Some key principles were decided on at the beginning of the Constitutional Convention. The delegates agreed voting should be by state, not by delegate. Also, they decided that the talks should be kept private while they were underway, so that the delegates could speak openly. A public announcement would be made once they had reached a final agreement. And so here's a picture of people at the Constitutional Convention. And it's numbered, some of the dudes. Of course, number 1 should be easy to recognize as George Washington. Number 2, he should be pretty easy to recognize. That's Benjamin Franklin. 3 is James Madison, representative from Virginia. And then 4 over here is Alexander Hamilton. The Virginia Plan. On May 29, 1787, 4 days after the convention began, delegates began to discuss a draft constitution. It had been drafted mainly by James Madison, and because he represented Virginia, it came to be known as the Virginian Plan. Madison proposed a system of federal government that had two houses. Each house would be made up of representatives elected by voters from the 13 states. The number of representatives elected would be based on how many people lived in the state. He's from Virginia. Virginia's huge. He's going to want the number of representatives that his state gets to be based on how many people live in the state. There's definitely got to be some mention of the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan in your notes. New Jersey, on the other hand, Madison's Virginia plan was hotly debated because not everyone was in favor of it. Delegates from states with small populations felt that it was unfair to them, since they would end up with fewer representatives than the larger states and might be outvoted. William Patterson, a delegate from New Jersey, proposed a different plan. Under the New Jersey plan, there would be one House of Representatives, not two, and each state would just have one vote. The New Jersey plan was rejected. The Great Compromise. At the beginning of July, after weeks of discussion, a grand committee was appointed to break the deadlock. After 2 weeks, the committee delivered its report. It was proposed that in the upper house, or the Senate, each state would have an equal vote, regardless of population. However, in the lower house, each state would have one representative for every 40,000 inhabitants. The Great Compromise, as it was called, was the one that was accepted. The Constitution is signed. In late July, delegates began drafting the final version of the Constitution. The Virginia Plan was the starting point, taking into account the recommendations of the Great Compromise. Even while the drafting and redrafting were going on, delegates continued to debate the text of the emerging Constitution. The question of slavery was fiercely argued. Some states wanted it abolished, others didn't. A compromise was reached that the slavery issue would be resolved at a future date. They realized there was no compromise when it came to the issue of slavery, and there was no way that you were going to be able to reach a compromise. It was just too hot a topic, and they didn't want the country falling apart when it had just barely began to be formed. So the decision was made to not make a decision, to wait on that one until later. After all the disagreements had been settled, the Constitution of the United States of America was signed on September 17, 1787. Of the 55 original delegates, 42 were present, and of those, 39 signed the document. 3 delegates refused to sign. They believed the Constitution was flawed. The Constitution. We the people. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, so begins the Constitution of the United States of America. A landmark document not only for America, but the entire Western world. What is the Constitution? The Constitution is the highest law in the United States. It sets out how the system of national government should work. Under the terms of the Constitution, the national government was divided into 3 branches: the legislative, executive, and judicial. Separation of power. It was important to separate the government's power among 3 branches. It meant that no single branch had more power than the others, and each branch would watch over the others to make sure the system was working correctly. I mean, right now we're seeing the state version of this going on. With the whole court case involving the private schools. The governor said the private schools should be shut down. Originally, the state Supreme Court said no, that was a violation of the Constitution. Then the governor repealed that. Then it went to a different, branch of the Supreme Court. I don't know the state government as well as the United States government. Anyway, and then they repealed what the original court had said, and so now it's heading to the Supreme Court, United States Supreme Court. So we're seeing all this balancing of powers going on here with something that directly affects us. The 3 branches, the legislative, executive, and judicial branch. I'm not going to read that because we've talked enough about those 3 branches. Spreading the word. On September the 19th, 1787, 2 days after the Constitution was signed, the American people were given their first chance to read it. The Pennsylvania Packet and Daily Advertiser, printed in Philadelphia, became the first newspaper to print the full text of the Constitution. As more newspapers did the same, more people throughout the states were able to read the Constitution for themselves. It was also printed in pamphlets and in the German language for German speakers in America. Constitution at a glance. Number of words in the document were 4,543, including the 39 signatures. Took 4 sheets of paper. The size of the sheets of paper were about 29 by 24 inches. It was written on parchment, treated animal skin, probably sheepskin. It was written with iron gall ink made from oak galls and iron sulfate. It takes about 30 minutes to read. Now, remember, this is written in the language of the time, in very legal language, so it would take me a lot longer than 30 minutes to read and get through the whole thing with all the legal mumbo-jumbo, which is why I like the 8th grade book. It's got the cheat notes on the side. Spelling mistakes, there's a couple in there, and it is at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. right now. James Madison, father of the Constitution. Like I said, you definitely need to have somewhere in your notes that he's the guy that was the father of the Constitution. He's the guy that originally came up with the idea for the Constitutional Convention. Some years after the Constitution was ratified or agreed upon, James Madison became known as the father of the Constitution because of everything he had done to make it happen. He protested, saying it's the work of many heads and many hands. See a picture here of his birthplace. He was born Port Conway, Virginia. He was born in 1751 on his grandparents' tobacco plantation at Port Conway, Virginia. He grew up in Orange County, Virginia, where his parents were prosperous tobacco planters. Madison was a gifted scholar. In 1769, he enrolled at the College of New Jersey, which is now called Princeton, where he completed a 4-year course in 2 years. The dude was smart and hardworking. He studied history, languages, government, or political science, and studied law. By 1774, Madison had focused on the biggest political issue at the time, independence from Great Britain, which he supported. In 1776, the year of the Declaration of Independence, Madison helped draft the Virginia Constitution. The colony declared its freedom from British rule and created the Virginia Assembly to govern its own affairs. The Virginia Constitution was important not just for Virginia, but for the future of the U.S., because it showed what was possible for other colonies. Between May and September 1787, Madison addressed delegates many times at the Constitutional Convention held in Philadelphia. He spoke clearly and convincingly about his ideas for a national government. Madison believed that the U.S. needed a strong central government in which power was divided into 3 branches so that none could overrule the others. Delegates agreed with Madison, and his ideas became part of the Constitution of the United States of America. His work did not end there, as the Constitution had to be ratified or approved by the states. To avoid ratification, Madison, with help from supporters, to push for ratification, Madison, with help from his supporters, won approval for the Constitution by writing a series of articles for newspapers. He became the 4th president. In 1812, a group of politicians urged him to declare war on Great Britain because the British had seized American ships and sailors. Madison was reluctant to send the new nation to war, but he did. The War of 1812 ended in 1815, with neither side able to claim an outright victory. However, it brought the states closer together, and the U.S. emerged as a stronger nation. A quote describing James Madison: "Every person seems to acknowledge his greatness. In the management of every question, he evidently took the lead in the convention," meaning the Constitutional Convention. Final years of his life. He left office in 1817 and spent the rest of his life on his 5,000-acre tobacco plantation in Montpelier, Orange County, Virginia. He believed in modern methods of farming without using slaves and worked to abolish slavery and helped to resettle some freed slaves in Liberia, West Africa. Ratifying the Constitution. Remember, ratifying means to approve. So these dudes came up with the Constitution at the Constitutional Convention. Now it's got to be approved. And the Constitution which was signed on September 17th, 1787, at the Constitutional Convention, did not come into force or did not come into play, did not start working immediately. It had to be approved by 9 of the 13 states. After a few days after the Constitution was signed, Congress sent printed copies of it to all 13 states. Each state held a meeting to discuss it. This was the first chance for American citizens to talk about the plans for a new government. 5 state conventions voted to approve the Constitution almost immediately. Other states were less certain, and very soon a split had opened up between those in favor and those not in favor. The future of the fledgling U.S. was in the hands of the American people. Federalists, the people in favor of a federal government, are the Federalists. People who supported the Constitution called themselves Federalists. Many were rich business people, such as property owners, planters, and merchants, and professionals, including lawyers. Supporters tend to live in towns, not in the countryside. The Federalist cause was helped because the 2 most famous men in America, Benjamin Franklin and George Washington, supported it. Also, most newspapers were owned by Federalists, so they printed the Federalist papers, the newspapers would, and the Federalist papers were in favor of the Constitution. The anti-Federalists are the dudes not in favor. People opposed to the Constitution were called anti-Federalists. Their greatest fear was that the individual states would have their power taken away. They were against a strong federal government, so they were anti-Federalists. Anti-Federalists tended to live in the countryside where they worked on small farms. Like the Federalists, they also had influential men on their side. Patrick Henry was an anti-Federalist. Richard Henry Lee, James Winthrop, and George Clinton all criticized the Constitution. The most famous of all those dudes, of course, is Patrick Henry. Federalist papers. In an effort to persuade voters to approve the Constitution, Federalists, like James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay, used newspapers to spread their message. Between 1787 and 1788, they wrote 85 essays that explained what it would mean to have a national government. Most of these Federalist papers were first printed in New York state newspapers, after which they were printed in newspapers in other states. The essays convinced people to vote in favor of the Constitution. The identity of the 3 authors was a closely guarded secret. Instead of using their own name, each essay was attributed to the made-up author Publius. By June 21st, 1788, 9 of the 13 states had voted to ratify the Constitution. On that day, the opening words of the Constitution, "We the people, in order to form a more perfect union," had become true. By late May 1790, the remaining 4 states had also voted in favor. And I'm getting ready to show you a political cartoon that shows the states as a series of pillars. The message was, united they stand, divided they fall. And there's the political cartoon, a more perfect union. All right. And that's where we will end. We will pick up tomorrow reading about finishing up the book, reading a little bit of the last of the book. And tomorrow, Friday, you will attach your notes that you have been taking about this book and what I have been reading. So, sorry, I meant to have 3 videos, one Wednesday, one Thursday, one Friday. I couldn't get it to work. So you're going to either have to watch 2, well, it kind of depends on how well this one loads, but you're going to end up watching 2 videos one day. But the Friday one will be shorter, I think, and then getting your notes turned in on Friday. See you all later.